Well, hello, everybody. I'm excited to get started again today. Welcome. You may hear a little groveliness in my voice again. Another summer/spring/summer cold underway. And hopefully everyone's having a wonderful spring and enjoying this incredible weather that we're having around the country and various places. So let's go ahead and get started. Today, as promised, we're going to do a deep dive into just a litany of terms and terminology inside of the BPM world. And so this is part of our level 3 certification. In this space, our focus, as you know, is around building a PIO, or process improvement organization. And from that perspective, we're taking a look at a couple of the components, the key components around building a very influential and highly effective PIO for your organization, and also advancing for yourself in terms of your professional development, having a good deep understanding of that environment. Today, what we're going to do is take a quick step back. We're going to take a look at a variety of different terms and terminology, different techniques, methodologies, and basically a spaghetti pot of terms, if you will. And so some of these may be new to you. Some of these you may be quite familiar with. We just want to make sure that we have a good, solid foundation around all of them. So today, let's just go ahead and move forward here so we can take a quick look. The focus is an overview, if you will, of our process improvement dictionary. I am going to talk about a couple of methodologies and approaches that we utilize in the BPM world. And also, all the way down, we'll drill down into very specifically into some terms and terminology that are used around process maps, simply in looking at process maps. So we get ourselves all anchored around that. And we'll do that also in the context of the environment of ProMap as well. So for those of you that are our ProMap clients that we've worked with, or perhaps you're interested in exploring that as a particular tool set for capturing processes, capturing knowledge, and sharing that knowledge, then this will give you a nice little orientation to that environment as well. Okay, so as you know, the importance of having a common lexicon is first and, is really paramount, right? So if you just imagine, for example, if you imagine coming into a company for the first time, which most of us have done, and you are walking in for the first time, and there's a certain language that takes place inside of that organization, a certain lexicon, if you will. Acronyms mean a certain thing. Different terms mean specific things within different industries, for example. Some of you may have heard me share this example before. I'll give you this one from my own personal experience, and that is the acronym JV. So, so first I just ask you the question, how many of you, are familiar with the term JV and what JV means? Well, some of you might say, well, JV means junior varsity, right? Or it might mean joint venture, or it might mean journal voucher, or it might mean any variety of those things. So my own personal experience, the first company that I worked for, JV meant journal voucher. And so I got quite seeped in that definition of that acronym to mean journal voucher. After 18 years, I left and I went to a new company, and they were using the term JV. And of course, I thought I knew what they were talking about, but it started showing up in kind of these weird contexts. And so I dug into it a little bit more. And so I asked, what does JV mean? And they said, oh, it means joint venture here. So all of a sudden, what I had known as journal voucher now became redefined. Hence the importance of being able to really get a common set of understanding and knowledge around the terms and the definitions we use. So as you're bringing your PIO together and really starting to get some traction inside of your organization, remember to pay attention to the details. Pay attention to these small points, the terminology that you utilize, and take time to educate. Knowing that some people may already know the definitions, or like me, they may have very different definitions. And so it's important to get that common understanding. All right, so our discussion path today, for those of you that are new, these are called our SNAP webinars. We're going to do a quick little welcome, which we just had. We'll dive into some components that are best practices and are intended to help you build a strong continuous improvement culture, really foundational elements around these areas. And then we'll dive into ProMap a little bit, and I'll give you some context. So for today, our theme is around terms and terminology. And that's where we're going to spend our theme as we go throughout all of these elements here. Then we'll take a quick look at what next week's topic is, and we'll be on our way. So we shoot for 20 to 30 minutes each shot. All right, let's go ahead and get rolling. So from this standpoint, first area of terminology I want everyone to be familiar with, okay? And remember, we do this in terms of the evolution of process management over time. All right. And so when we think about the evolution, some terms and terminology that you want to be familiar with and would benefit in helping to educate your colleagues and your constituents around as well, as this will really help lay a nice solid foundation for you as you bring process improvement into your organization. A couple of things here. First of all, so from a evolution perspective, you may hear terms like total quality management. Total quality management being that concept of looking at the actual quality of the output and considering all of the steps that go into a particular process to deliver that quality. This is also the birth of ISO 9000, ISO 9001, 9002, et cetera, et cetera. And from this perspective, a very quantifiable approach to quality management. So total quality management, you may also hear referred to as TQM. This evolved into the topic and the term business process reengineering. And here now we started to look more holistically. So when you're talking about business process reengineering, you are tending to look at a broader basis of processes and processes that go across multiple functional areas. And the re-engineering element is the element of effectively redesigning, in many cases, how a process functions in order to affect the output. All right, so that's what we want to think about from that standpoint. Now, enterprise process management is distinctly different. So enterprise process management, the definition around this, what we want to keep in mind is that this tends to also be very client focused or customer focused and reverse engineering, if you will. So from this standpoint, we're looking across the entire enterprise. You may also hear this defined or the term utilized here as end to end. Okay, so that's what we mean in this space, leading to, from an evolutionary standpoint, leading to something that you're probably hearing more and more about now around process-based competition. And process-based competition is a mind shift. It is a spot where businesses really start to differentiate themselves in terms of the power of their processes, the efficacy of the processes, how efficiently and effectively they execute against those. So these are all four terms that you will hear as you're thinking about and speaking with people around the evolution of process management. Now, from that standpoint, the next piece is what are some of the programs that often show up in this space? So from a programmatic standpoint, some of the things that I want you to be familiar with, you know, and you're operating in a world, if TQM, total quality management, TQM, if that is common in your lexicon, in your terminology, you will have a lot of discussions around process mapping, team facilitation, root cause analysis, or RCA often it's referred to, and then of course SPC, or statistical process control. Again, in all of four of these areas, there is a deep quantitative element to this, and certainly in terms of the process mapping and RCA and SPC. All right, so to learn more about each of these particular methodologies, I would encourage you to grab a hold of a, find yourself a really good process reengineering or TQM book that will dive into these specific methodologies. But what I want you to take away from these in terms of the terms and terminology, when you're hearing these or when you're utilizing these are much more quantitative in nature. Okay, so you will find quite a bit in terms of measurements and controls in this space. Now, the next piece around BPR, so business process reengineering. So in the world of business process reengineering, the types of terms and terminology, the methodologies that you will hear, you'll start to get a sense that some of these are both qualitative as well as quantitative. So of course, process mapping, which is going to carry across all of these phases, but you start to get into things that are also much more creative approaches, if you will, much more qualitative as well. So creative destruction, for example, a way to really break down processes and be able to get to the core or the heart, if you will. So from that standpoint, being able to creatively destroy a process in order to find its key elements and build up from there. You'll still also in here, of course, get quite a bit of quantitative elements, cost value analysis, for example, or value cost analysis, VCA. You may hear that term or that acronym used there. And then we also get some more of the qualitative again, so change management. Now, this is a space that in a future session, we're going to do a really deep dive around change and change management. This is an element because of its qualitative nature. It can be, well, let's just say frustrating sometimes. It feels like you're making progress, and then other times you just wonder. So we are going to do a deep dive into change and change management and some of the programmatic and more program management approaches that we can take in that space to really help an organization evolve. Now let's move forward. So enterprise process management to the next wave. Here, the types of terms and terminology that you may hear. Again, org chart analysis is one, looking at where the relationships are within an organization, both the formal relationships as well as interesting and very important, those informal relationships and those influential relationships and how work really gets done. And so these are some very powerful tools and approaches here. This is also where performance management comes into play. And from a definition standpoint, as we're thinking about process improvement, performance management goes beyond the individual employee performance management. It truly goes to the performance of a process. How consistently does a process deliver the results that it's expected to deliver? How consistently and what is the frequency of that? Okay. So from this standpoint, these are some of the terms and terminology that you'll start to hear in this space. Now, the next piece is from a process-based competition standpoint. So in here, now we get some really cool methodologies that start to emerge, and you will get the sense that much of this also is very qualitative in nature. Again, the definition of qualitative being much harder to measure, right? Quantitative being quite measurable. So in this space, as we're thinking about organizations that are really leveraging their processes as a key differentiator and the way that they execute on their processes, here are some of the terms and terminology that you're going to hear would be things like a SWOT analysis. So strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. So SWOT analysis is a very common tool that's used in this space, and it's used on a pretty good frequency as well. From that standpoint, these are some of the terms and terminology that you're going to be hearing taken from the context of the evolution of process management. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at two perspectives on process management and some of the terms and terminology that will pop up in this space. So if you're working with an organization that has a very traditional process management approach, some of the things that you will quickly come across here is that you will, of course, within the organization, you're going to be hearing things like, if it's not broken, don't fix it, okay? In other words, the organization really doesn't care about the process until the result is bad, right? So you're going to start hearing some things like this. Now, you might also be hearing terms or people speaking in a language that speaks of firefighting, reactive, those types of terms being used in the organization. So the reason I bring it up from this perspective of traditional process management, and then we'll look at the other angle as well in a more proactive process management. The reason I wanted to take a look at terms and terminology here is because you want to be listening for what are the terms that people are using, what language are they using, and actually leverage that in terms of your ability to influence, okay? So the language is going to help you also assess where you are, and by the use of your language, then you will be able to influence where the organization goes, right? So in this space, in traditional process management, this is where you want to be listening for these kinds of words, right? Like firefighting and reacting. And then also recognize that we want to be, in traditional process management, we're focused on something called the gap. Okay, so the term the gap is intended to define where a process should end up, or what a process should deliver versus what it does deliver. Okay, that is the gap, quite simply. Okay, so now that I've defined it, it's probably like, well, yeah, of course, now we got that. All right, so from that standpoint, this is something that you want to be defining for your organization. If you're educating your team, you're bringing them along on this process improvement journey, and you want to be defining the gap. You want to be talking about these terms, okay? So from that standpoint, the gap. So what is the gap more quantitatively? And feel free to take screenshots of anything that I put up here, of course, and you'll have reference to it as well going forward. So the gap, quite simply put, is that we have our inputs. Now, inputs are, in effect, the raw materials. So inputs have a very important definition in the world of process improvement, process management, okay? So inputs are in effect the raw materials, the data, for example, a report. If you're in a true manufacturing environment, they may be a piece of plastic, for example, that gets converted. So these inputs come in, and those inputs are then acted upon inside of the process. And then the process, by virtue of converting those inputs, the process generates outputs. Outputs are the end result of your process. So it might be, again, the creation of the annual reports for the company, or it might be the creation of a shoe if you're a shoe manufacturer, okay? So outputs are also very tangible, all right? Now, the gap, defining the gap, is what is the quality of those outputs and the frequency of those outputs relative to what we anticipated receiving. And in a traditional process management environment, what you are going to observe is that focus tends to be on the gap. Okay? So all of that, again, to help get us grounded around common terms and terminology in this space. The next piece is, if we look from a different angle rather than traditional process management, let's look at this from a systems thinking best practice perspective, okay? So from here, some things that you're going to see is that we have a focus that is around the entire process, the entire ecosystem. All right, so the ecosystem, another term, the ecosystem is referring to the inputs plus the processes plus the outputs holistically. Okay, so from that standpoint, what we're looking at is we have a term again called design failures. So our focus around design failures have to do with if the process holistically, the inputs plus what happens in the execution and the translation of those inputs into outputs, plus the outputs, if that whole system is not capable of meeting the requirements, then we have something called a design failure. All right, so design failure is another term that we want to take away with us, and we want to make sure that we're leveraging that and kind of bringing in all of these terms and terminology again. So from this standpoint, and this module here will serve as a great reference for you for the future if you're creating a glossary of terms and terminology, of course, okay? So from this standpoint, design failures occur if the process is not capable of meeting those. Now, there's a distinction, another term for you to take away, and this term is called deployment failures. So deployment failures occur when you have a perfectly good design and it's not given the inputs required to create an acceptable outcome. In other words, where you will see your organization focusing rather than in the traditional where it focused on the gaps, where you will see your organization focusing if they are not getting the desired outputs is that they will focus on the quality of the input. Very critical here. So from this standpoint, deployment failures occur when the inputs have failed. Okay, so this is an important element as you're getting your terms and terminology nailed down for your organization. You do want to think about what stage is your organization in terms of the process evolution. So that first slide that we were looking at with the evolutionary aspects, that will help guide you in terms of the tools and the methodologies that you want to be utilizing for your organization. And then you also want to be thinking about, is my organization today more traditionally focused, in which case I want to be educating them around terms such as the gap, or is my organization today, or where we are headed, more systems thinking, in which case I want to be educating them around terms such as design failures and deployment failures. Okay? All right, so from this standpoint, we've covered a lot of ground right at this moment, and kind of thrown a bunch of terms and terminology over the fence to you at the moment. So, so let's go ahead and do a deep dive. Okay. So now we're going to do a dive into kind of the belly all the way down now to the process level. Okay. And this will be, you know, for those of you who are familiar with ProMap, some of this will be familiar to you in this landscape, this environment. For those of you who are not familiar with ProMap, this will give you a little orientation to the tool set as well. And I would love to go deeper with you at some point as well, and we do a little demo around the tool set. But what I want to focus on now are some of the key elements for any program that you are running, regardless of the software or tool set that you may be utilizing to help enable you. Any program that you are running should have some of these common features and functionality, okay? And so when you're designing, you want to be thinking about these terms and terminologies. All right, so the first piece, when someone is looking at a process, and like we have laid out here, our process, some terms and terminology. First of all, swim lanes, okay? So most of you are probably familiar with swim lanes, and you know, those are, you know, these lanes here in which our activities occur, and it, you know, appropriately called swim lane because it looks like a swim lane in a swimming pool. And interestingly enough, the language that we often hear the organization using can be very telling in this. They might say, hey, you know, stay in your own swim lane, or, you know, get out of my swim lane, right? So you might actually hear this kind of terminology. Here we're actually codifying the term to swim lane, all right? So as you're educating people, again, focusing on this term, these terms and terminology. You will also have terms and terminology, those people that are responsible, or those roles that are responsible for doing certain actions within the process. Now, we will do a deep dive in a future session around the RACI chart. So RACI, RACI is another term and terminology that you kind of want to keep a note on. And we'll do a deep dive on that particular methodology, RACI. RACI is an acronym, and it stands for responsible for doing the work, accountable for the overall efficacy of a process, for example, consulted, and informed. All right, so we'll do a deep dive on that one later, but RACI, R-A-C-I, is the term you ought to jot down now. Okay, so these are a few of the terms that you're going to see around your process maps. Now, in addition to that, what we will also see, we're going to have references to processes. So you would be amazed at how many people, just when we start saying the word process, they conjure up a completely different picture than what we might be envisioning. Okay, this is kind of a JV example, all right, joint venture versus journal voucher. So you do want to make sure that you are very clear in your precise definition of what is a process. And a process definition, for example, might be, it's a sequence of steps that are taken in order to transform inputs into outputs. All right, so that would be our definition of process. A series of steps that are taken to transform inputs into outputs. All right, now in addition to that, you might also have an architecture for your processes. And so that might be an architecture where you group together certain processes that are common, and those might be considered process groups, for example. Okay, so that's a grouping of common processes. One of the things in your organization as you're building out your PIO and really thinking about how you want to capture all of your processes and really manage them quite effectively, there will emerge a very logical grouping, and that's what you're aiming for here. Okay. Now, a few other terms and terminology. I just want to zero in on this particular slide here. So inside of your process, you have a sequence of steps or sometimes these are referred to as activities. All right, so an activity is a higher level step that's taken in order to, again, in some respects, you could think of it actually transform inputs that are coming from the previous step, transform them into outputs that go to the next step in the sequence. Okay, so this might be referred to as a step or an activity within your process. And then lastly, we'll zero in here around tasks, notes, and attachments. So very clear and distinct and important definitions around each one of these. So tasks are those much lower level steps that are taken in order to execute an activity. Okay, flip the switch, for example, in order to execute the activity of turning on the lights, which turning on the lights is an activity in the sequence of preparing the room for the meeting. Okay, so from that standpoint, we want to get very distinct in our definitions and our terminology. Okay. Now, the next piece, let's go ahead and take a quick look at this as well. So from this standpoint, just to make sure that people are oriented, and again, regardless of what tool set you might be using, you want to make sure, again, that people get a really good orientation and get the common language. Okay, so for example, process ownership. Process ownership is one of those that when we think about a process, we have owners of a process, and then we have experts for a process, and then we have people who have a role or a responsibility to execute particular steps in that process, right? Okay, so let's just break those down real quick. So process ownership, when we define ownership of our processes, you want to be really clear that the owner is the person who is responsible for the overall efficacy of the process. Is it easy to understand? Is it well written? How does it fit within the bigger context? That is distinctly different than someone that is named as a process expert. Okay? So what would be an example of a process expert, or what other term might we use to refer to a process expert? Well, process subject matter expert, a SME, a subject matter expert. That is a process expert. They're a subject matter expert. They know how the work gets done. They're involved in the day-to-day aspects of the work. They actually are the ones that you might have a new hire shadow. Okay, so again, it's important to get the distinction of these definitions for your organization. Okay. The tool set that you use may ultimately provide some definitions for you and may start to codify that for you as well. Or again, if you're designing a solution for yourself, then take the time to get really clear on these. It will pay off in spades downstream for you, and it is a critical element of change management. All right. So also from this standpoint, you might also get into some very specific elements that have to do with how you view information or how you filter information. Okay. So again, the same thing, the terms and terminology that you use. I would say that there is a direct correlation between the clarity of the terms and ensuring that people are using common definitions. There's a direct correlation between clarity and conformity and overall success of your process improvement initiative and of your process improvement organization as a whole. Okay, so you want to make sure that you take the time to define these terms. Now, I've covered a lot of ground, kind of started out big picture. We looked at the evolution of process management, some of the terms, terminology in that space. We looked at some of the programs more specifically depending on what stage of evolution your organization is in, and some of those, the specific programs and the definitions around those as well. We looked at some terms and terminology as it has to do with whether your organization is more traditional in nature or if they're a more system orientation in nature. And so how the terms and terminology that you hear will differ. And then also, excuse me, how you can actually lead your organization by choosing the terms and the terminology, by actually focusing people, for example, on, in a systems environment, focusing them around inputs and the quality of the inputs, versus in a traditional environment where people are focused on the quality of the output, the gap at the end. Okay, so from that standpoint, let's just take a quick look, see if we've got any questions or anything that we might have. and we can open it up and just see if we have anyone wants to share any questions or any words that you've got. And so it looks like we're pretty clear on the questions at the moment. So let's go ahead and take a quick peek at what next week's session is going to be. I'm excited next week. So next week, we're actually going to go a little deeper now into the governance structure. Now that we have some common terms and terminology, we've got a little bit of that basis now in play. What I want to do is look at governance structures and what the skills are that are required to have an effective process improvement organization, an effective PIO. What skills you should be looking for, both for your team as well as for developing for yourself in terms of being an effective process improvement leader, and what the governance structures are that you want to make sure you have in place in your organization or on your team to get into that really nice cadence, you know, that nice clip where, I don't know, things they just seem to go smooth. And then if something doesn't, well, we deal with it, okay? So that's what we're going to zero in on next week. If you have any questions in the meantime, please just reach out to me, give me a holler, shoot an email over to info@pendolinogroup.com or a quick call. That'll go straight to my cell phone. I look forward to connecting up with you. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I look forward to our session next week. Take care.